This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are talking with Nicholas Eberstadt, a political economist and demographer at the American Enterprise Institute, who holds the Henry Wendt Chair in Political Economy at AEI. He is an advisor to the National Board of Asian Research and is a member of the Commission on Key National Indicators, and he is on the Global Agenda Council at the World Economic Forum. He also recently received the Bradley Prize. We're discussing with him his book, A Nation of Takers, America's Entitlement Epidemic. Mr. Eberstadt, welcome to the show. Glad to have you.
Thank you for inviting me.
So your book, it's an aggressive title, A Nation of Takers, and your benchmark comparison is the year 1960. And you chart in almost depressing detail the rise of the entitlement state over this period. Give us, outline for us the magnitude of the problem we face.
Well, it's a very brief book because a lot of the trends can be very succinctly described. We can look at two different sides. We can look at what's happened to the federal government, and we can look at what's happened to recipients in the general population in the United States. If we look at what's happened to the federal government, we can see that in 1960, as in almost every previous year in American history, and back to the establishment of the Constitution, the federal government allocated the overwhelming majority of its resources to just that, to governing, to defense, to justice, paying the national debt, whatever. Back in 1960, less than $1 in 3 of federal spending went to our then panoply of entitlement programs. 50 years later, 2010, to use a nice 50-year benchmark, the situation had really dramatically changed. By 2010, roughly $2 out of 3 in federal spending went just to the transfers that were being issued by the entitlement programs. That's not even counting the administrative costs of those programs. Only $1 in 3 went to all of the rest of America's federal government. So the federal government in this 50-year period was completely inverted as an operation. And by 2010, the U.S. federal government had, for all intents and purposes, become an entitlements machine. That was what it did. That was its allocative priorities and concerns and all of the rest. That's one part. That's what's happened to our government. But what's happened to our people? According to the most recent stats I was able to get from the Census Bureau for American public, which is for last year, almost 50% of Americans lived in households that were receiving one or more transfer benefits from the federal government, almost 50%. That was up by fully 20 percentage points from the early 1980s over that 30-year period. Now, we know that our population is aging and that older people are entitled to Social Security and Medicare, so we might think of this as being a phenomenon of population aging. Absolutely not. Of the roughly 150 million people in the United States living in homes that were getting government transfer benefits last year, only 50 million lived in homes that were getting Social Security, which is to say that about 100 million additional recipients have to be accounted for. And by 2011, it turns out that over a third of Americans lived in homes that are getting poverty-based benefits. It's called means-tested benefits, Medicaid, food stamps, temporary assistance for needy families, housing subsidies, and the rest, which is about twice as high a fraction as just 30 years ago. We are on a course, it may not be continued, but we are on a course where a majority of Americans within our lifetimes would be on means-tested, poverty-based benefits. And as you can see, that's not because a majority of Americans, by any conception, would be considered desperately poor. So this is the overarching set of trends that I describe in this little book, and then of course I go into more detail about the particular allocative functions, the trend of expenditures, and most importantly to me, how I think this has changed the nature of civic life in America.
Yeah, I really want to talk with you about the transformation of citizens under this entitlement regime. I want to ask you a quick question that I've had on my mind. How do the rise of healthcare costs, I mean, just the sheer rise in that part of the economy, account for the entitlement growth spending, particularly, I mean, Medicare and Medicaid are a huge part of this. And is it a question of growing dependency, or is it also maybe, I guess it's not separate, just the growth of cost of meeting healthcare needs?
Well, that's an excellent question. We have become increasingly a healthcare economy. The health services sector has dramatically increased as a share of our overall economy. And since health guarantees are a big part of commitments within this health sector, the health entitlements have exploded. We didn't have, really to speak of, big health entitlements until the mid-1960s, when the Medicaid and the Medicare programs were devised. And if you put those two programs together, I'm doing this off the top of my head, so don't pillory me if I'm off by a point or two. If you put those two together, you come up with probably well over $1 trillion out of a $2.4 trillion entitlement transfer. Nearly $2.4 trillion last year. So it's very substantial, but it's not the whole show. We have had entitlements with or without healthcare commitments rise at an exponential rate, at an exponential pace over the period from 1960 to the present. The overall tempo of entitlement growth has been twice as fast as the growth of U.S. Per capita income over this period, so that transfers from the government have gone from being about 6% of personal income to close to a fifth, 18% or something like that. And other programs, non-health programs, have also increased geometrically in their pace. You put everything together. If you put everything together, we are transferring almost $8,000 a year per man, woman, and child today in entitlements. Less than half of that is healthcare, although the healthcare portion is appreciable.
Let me ask you a question. I think it's a related question to this. So we've had also over this 50-year period, other interesting parts of our national story, economic story, government story. One is large increases in wealth overall. And so you would think that would actually lead to a diminished need for entitlements, particularly means-tested benefits, yet that hasn't occurred, as you have documented. And I guess one thing we can say is perhaps it's Say's law of entitlements. If you supply it, they will come. We've also had tremendous gains in public health yet healthcare costs continue to rise, Medicare, Medicaid costs continue to rise. We also have, as you note, which I think is on a lot of people's minds as well, is just abuse of the federal disability benefits program. But also we've had kind of commensurate with the economic rise, many would say, and even not even kind of a far out critique, but something like globalism, entrepreneurial rise, so the things that happened in the 1980s especially, that we lost kind of stability in employment, and now we have a mismatch of policies. We have a badly out-of-date healthcare policy, right? You get your insurance from your employer. That doesn't seem to work for a lot of reasons anymore. We also have, it seems, a problem for younger families in particular, not being able to or finding it difficult, one, to find healthcare, but also to find a way just to provide in more than just a meager fashion for themselves. We don't have a tax policy that seems to be favorable to them or policies favorable to them. And also kind of just the retreat of overall manufacturing jobs, particularly one for men who, have just, don't have, specified training. And so people have to turn to something. And it seems so one logical response has been Medicaid and other entitlement programs. How does that shape? Do you think that's a valid criticism, or are there ways we need to adjust to try and account for these things that have happened? Or
no, I think that that's very important to note. I mean, we've had a sea change in society and economy in the period since 1960. We've also had a renewed surge of immigration into the United States, especially since the change in immigration laws in '65. That's also changed the profile of American society. All of that, I think, has to be taken into account. Let me mention two other things which also, I think, bear directly upon the situation. One is I'm sure there's a nicer word for this, but the collapse of the American family structure. I wouldn't want to sugarcoat what American families were like in 1960, but they're palpably different today. At this point in time, over 40% of American kids are born outside of marriage. Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who is one of the great policy analysts, social scientists, political intellectuals in America in his lifetime, wrote a famous, sometimes reviled, but I think quite accurate report on the crisis in the black family in the mid-1960s. When he wrote that, he was dealing with data which suggested that the illegitimacy ratio in the black community had just hit the 25% line. The corresponding ratio for so-called white Americans, non-Hispanic Anglo types, is now 29%. It's higher than it was for African Americans when Moynihan wrote his famous report. And at this point in time, about 3 in 10 children in America are living in what used to be called broken homes, in homes without two parents, whether they're biological parents or not. That's a higher fraction than for any Western industrial democracy. It's higher than in Scandinavia. We can't understand where we are today unless we understand what's happened to our families. We probably also need to understand the role of religion and faith in civic community in the United States. We're a very different society from European societies, especially from continental Europe, but from European societies in general. One of the aspects of American exceptionalism, and I think there definitely is, at least so far, in American exceptionalism, is the role that religion and faith has had in civic life and civic society. That's part of what has distinguished us from our continental brothers. That's been intimately related to philanthropy and civil participation and civic action in the United States, which even ever since Tocqueville's day we've noted was different over here from on the other side of the Atlantic. The the religious fabric in the United States may still be stronger than in, essentially post-religious modern Europe, but it's fraying very rapidly. It's declining. The most recent Pew survey in this question shows the proportion of Americans who say they have no religion increasing by about 1% a year. That's a really fast trend for social change. That inescapably has an impact upon philanthropy and charitable giving and volunteering and all of the things which are in the civic side of the equation that the government doesn't necessarily have to be responsible for. We have to bring that into account as well.
Because no, go ahead. I'm sorry.
But your question about the change in the economy is a really important one, and it's really striking to see what's happened with the trend in means-tested recipients. From the 1980s to the present, there's been virtually no correspondence between the unemployment rate and the percentage of Americans on means-tested benefits. The unemployment rate goes up, the percentage of recipients goes up. The unemployment rate goes down, the percentage of recipients goes up. Same thing with the poverty rate as measured. They provide almost no information about changes in recipients. The one good predictor of changes in recipients is the calendar year. With each passing calendar year, the level of recipients, the proportion of recipients tends to go up. It's going up by a little bit more than 4 percentage points a year. And if we really thought that the entitlement situation was in some fundamental sense tied to our macroeconomy, we'd expect a correspondence between unemployment, poverty, and means-tested benefits. We just see it now.
Let me ask you a question. So we just had a national election. One party sort of kind of hinted at a way to rethink Medicare with competitive bidding amongst insurance companies to try and bring costs down in some fashion through that process. And it seemed there was no dramatic fallout necessarily from that policy, proposition. However, there was this insistence that Social Security and Medicare were things people had earned. And that seems to be largely the public consensus on this. This isn't dependency. I've paid into this. But let me ask you, do people, the contributions they make, is it commensurate with what they take out? Or are people receiving from Social Security and Medicare far greater than what they put in, making these programs themselves largely unsustainable, even according to the public consensus?
That's a really important question. And you only need to go to the actuaries of the trust funds in question, Social Security and Medicare, to get the answers, and they'll tell you the programs are completely underfunded. They're actuarially unsound. Their unfunded liabilities at present comprise tens of trillions of dollars. They've overpromised. So there's no way that those commitments can be honored unless they take money from outside of the existing system or change their rules. Our political class in Washington has really disserved our society by encouraging the myth that these are genuine social insurance programs as people understand those terms. I mean, a social insurance program would be, kind of like a government version of GEICO. People pay in, you pool risk, you're covered, and and the whole thing is kind of in balance. Not at all. It's an entitlement system into which people have made contributions. So they know about the contributions. They're not aware that they're getting much more than they've put in. I think a lot of people who are beneficiaries of our so-called social insurance programs would be mortified to think of themselves as takers. They don't think they've been takers at all over their lives. They've worked hard and I suppose misinformed into this position. But this points, I think, to something more more broad and disturbing, which is the unspoken consensus in Washington between the two parties to encourage the state of affairs that we've gotten to with our entitlement system. You will find a few honorable individual exceptions to the generalization I'm going to make. But the generalization is that Democratic and Republican alike have worked together to encourage the metastasizing entitlement state in the U.S. If you look back over the past half century, one very strange finding that I came up with was that entitlement spending tends to grow more rapidly under Republican presidents than under Democratic presidents. I mean, you can show this statistically. It's quite a strong result. When you think about it in particular terms, it wasn't true of the Reagan administration, but it certainly was true of the Nixon administration and the Ford administration and the George W. Bush administration, which provided over especially lavish increases in our entitlement state. Now, it is true, when you get back to the 2012 election, it is true that the Republican side in the presidential race came up with some broad ideas about addressing or redressing some of the overspending by our entitlement state in the future. I'm afraid that the contribution of that campaign to public discourse is more likely to remain Mitt Romney's fabled 47% comment, which was it was quoted out of context. It was quoted in private, but people who are running for president need to be grown up enough to know that they're always going to be listened to. It was a terribly mangled and botched presentation on a problem. The 47% wasn't about entitlements exactly. It was about people who weren't paying income taxes. It seems to me that that's a completely different argument from entitlements for two reasons. Number one, almost everybody pays taxes of some sort, if not income taxes, payroll taxes, not payroll taxes, property taxes or sales taxes. Almost everybody in the United States pays tax. We've got a lot of taxes in America. Almost everybody pays some taxes. Number two, I think there's a really good reason to argue that all Americans should pay at least some federal tax. But that reason has nothing to do with entitlements. It's the U.S. federal government. The federal government is the people who are charged with protecting us against enemies, foreign and domestic. I mean, is it really true that somebody can't pay $1, $5, $10 for the support of our national defense against the outside world? That seems to me to be a question about citizenship. But it's a different question about citizenship from the question of entitlements and how entitlements may be degrading citizenship in the U.S. So, I think that was a total muddle, a total mangle, and the end result of it is, nowadays, if somebody wants to talk about entitlements, you can shut down the argument with the mocking, ha, 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 47%, ha, 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 and that means we're not going to talk about it again for years.
Interesting, as well, Paul Ryan's method of dealing with Medicare, his proposed method, doesn't nearly cut enough to deal with the problem, even though that itself was barely, I think, inside the realm of acceptable public discourse. What are the magnitude or what are the level of cuts that we need to make? What kind of a welfare state? Because it's clearly we're going to have some kind of a welfare state. What can we afford? And I'm just thinking, just concretely, and I think, Bill Voegeli had a great book on the never-ending welfare state, and trying to change the discussion that way. Have you I mean, what do you think along those lines?
Well, the question of what we can afford is obviously a very subjective one, because it depends on your priorities and your tastes and your tolerances and other things like that. I mean, the question of what we can afford is not a scientific question. It's a subjective question. If you look at the way we have decided to afford our existing system, you see some, to me, pretty disturbing tendencies right now. I mean, one of the big differences between the U.S. welfare state and the European welfare states is that we've decided to finance our welfare state on a credit card, much more than they have. We are, in effect, taxing the unborn to pay for our current consumption benefits in entitlement programs. And one of the nice things about doing that is that the unborn don't have a vote on this. I mean, it's a perfect public choice conundrum, or, agent principle conundrum, And so we have increasingly moved towards borrowing our way out of our entitlement obligations today, and that's neat because it means that our political classes don't need to have our citizens vote on the tax levels that would be needed to cover our welfare commitments right now. So, and stay tuned for more of that. Another thing which relates to the question of affordability is crowding out our constitutional commitments for governance. At the moment, our federal government is spending $3 on entitlement transfers for every $1 on national defense. And that ratio is about to get even more extreme as entitlement commitments increase and as the war in Iraq has wound down, the war in Afghanistan winds down, getting back towards earlier baseline. There is enormous pressure, as you know, today in Washington to cut the defense budget because it is unaffordable. Exactly how is it that defense is unaffordable when we're spending 3 times as much on entitlements? Only if you hold entitlement growth as sacrosanct, decide that the obligation of the United States is to make the world safe for American entitlement growth. We are at this point allocating less than half as much of our national resources to defense as when President Eisenhower issued his famous warning about the military-industrial complex back in '61. It looks from this sequestration debate that's going on in Washington right now, this little tragicomedy that's proceeding in Washington, as if people are much happier to think about our national defense than addressing the explosion of welfare entitlements. Now, I'm not suggesting that there isn't waste, fraud, and abuse in our defense budget. I don't see why the defense budget should be different from any other part of government. But I don't think that we should tailor our national defense allocations to what's left over after we've decided, only what's left over after we've decided that we've satiated ourselves on our domestic entitlement consumption.
Yeah, but this is played out in Canada, in the UK. I mean, Canada, as I've read, used to have a fierce military and navy, and this was cut, and the spending was transferred to the entitlements.
Well, it's happened in every modern industrial democracy. It's happened in ours last.
Let me ask you, this part of your book, The Transformation of Citizens, as I'm reading this, I'm also thinking of another great book on the welfare state, also a very short, powerful book, like yours, Bertrand de Jouvenel's The Ethics of Redistribution. And he makes this argument. There's an anthropology behind the welfare state, and he has this great observation that those building the welfare state have this conception of man, lonely men riding to and from work, coming home, masticating on a bone, and really just their lives are dominated by material necessity. And this is kind of it. And a lot of the things charitable associations, as you've been discussing, are crowded out, and those things are provided by paid employees of the government. And I guess my question, do you find that this sort of, there's almost like a materialistic assumption about man? There's no longer, the entrepreneurial aspect is gone, the spiritual aspect is gone, the notion of happiness is reduced and flattened, and there's really no density in society anymore. Is that a part of our welfare state, or is that only something that's recently arrived? I mean, it seems to me we do have, I mean, although as you've documented, we've been discussing the cost and the size are enormous at this point, but historically our welfare state has been limited and smaller to Western European counterparts to that of Canada. And now it's grown tremendously, and so it seems it would be unfair to attribute that sort of worldview or that understanding of man throughout our welfare state. But now it's there, and it seems, one evidence was the life of Julia, which received a lot of commentary, which was striking. As a young woman who doesn't marry, she has one child. She eventually works in the private sector, but yet even that is a partnership with the government. So that seems to me it is there. This is sort of the conception we're working with now.
Well, I mean, I kind of doubt that Michael Walzer is a regular Liberty Fund book published sort of guy, but Michael Walzer did make a point decades ago that the focus of Western governments over the past 4 centuries or so had gone from attention to the citizens or subject's soul to the citizens or subject's body. This had been a gradual, long-term change in the focus of the ends of government. And of course, this all predates the founding of the United States. We're very late to the game of modern welfare statism by comparison to Europe, and there are important historical reasons for that. The modern Swedish welfare state, which is kind of the trailblazer, the third way things in the 1920s were established for a pretty simple reason. Since World War I interrupted commerce across the Atlantic, the Swedes couldn't export their poor to Minnesota anymore. They had to figure out some way of dealing with this. Similar, if you look at the Beveridge Commission in the UK during the Second World War, there had to be a justification for why we fight or why they were fighting, and it had to do with compensating for what were broadly seen as the inequitable class barriers of UK society. And a similar narrative occurred for the Western European continental societies. We have very, very different history and a very, very different storyline from that. And one of the things, no matter what your religious adherence is in the United States, there's a strong streak of Puritanism in our national founding, and this led up until more or less yesterday to a very strong conception of the deserving and the undeserving poor. It's been really hard to get out of our system. Our government has been working very hard to get it out of our system over the last couple of decades, but some of it still lingers there. You take a look at what happened under the George W. Bush administration to some of our entitlement programs. And it's quite clear that the U.S. government was making an immense effort to destigmatize entitlement. One of the most obvious examples of this is what happened to food stamp programs. You and I know what we mean by food stamp programs, but if you look in the U.S. government lexicon nowadays, that term doesn't exist. It's gone. SNAP programs now. And by the way, there's no such thing anymore as food stamps, because food stamps might have been stigmatizing for those who were using them. Instead, during the George W. Bush administration, the government completed a transition from food stamps to a new kind of credit card called EBT cards. Look kind of like credit cards. You go into the supermarket, you use your EBT card. I mean, this is all part of a change in the approach to entitlements, which changes the nature of the relationship between citizen and government, or between taxpayer and recipient, to an important degree. What bothers me about this, I guess I'd say, is the connection between this rise of entitlements and the rise of something-for-nothing politics. That you are entitled to get things that you have not contributed to, and that these are your right. That can't help but affect the civic fabric and the nature of politics in the U.S., because demanding transfers from others, taking other people's property for transfers, your something-for-nothing politics, requires in most people's minds some sort of justification. And the sorts of justifications that probably will be most successful in this sort of conversation are justifications that point to a grievance. I don't see how you can separate in the future the financing of a growing entitlement state from the inculcation of grievances in American society. And that strikes me as a really unhealthy path for us.
So we have a populism of grievance, a myth or a narrative of American politics that somehow you're owed this because XYZ has happened to you or is not happening in your favor. It's interesting you contrast that with Reagan, particularly the 1980 campaign, a very different narrative about American life, which that in a way, you wonder, is there still a coalition that would respond to that, or how would one try and make those arguments in a new way, adapted to our times? It seems a difficult thing to do. I wanted to ask you, interesting point in your book, red state, red counties. Now, I mean, I've known for a long time that red states are takers with regard to federal largesse over a lot of the blue state counterparts, or just the sheer numbers. 100 most dependent counties in America, 2/3 of whom voted for the Republican presidential candidate, John McCain, in 2008. And this seems there's a lot of implications from that. One is people maybe don't even want to admit what it is they're doing. I don't know, or they disapprove. Or maybe they disapprove of what they're doing and they want a way out. I don't know. Is that why? Or is it just a lack of reflection, or the belief that this doesn't really affect you in any vital way, this doesn't affect America in any vital way? I don't know. I mean, the same seems to be true with regard to family life. Charles Murray talks about this as well in Coming Apart, that the upper 1/3 have fairly intact families, not so for the bottom 1/3. And yet, if you look at the way people vote, the bottom 1/3 would seem to care much more about, say, socially conservative issues. Maybe that's because their lives, they experienced the fallout and they want to do something about it. They see what it is. I don't know. But what do you take from that statistic?
Well, as I mentioned, the growth of entitlement expenditures has been markedly more extreme under Republican presidents as a whole than under Democratic presidents. I mean, you can dig a little bit deeper, but that's fact. And as you just mentioned, it is also a fact that the most entitlement-dependent counties in the United States, on the whole, tend to vote red, not blue. This tells me we've got this is not. We think of, or at least I think of, and I think many other people think of, the Democratic Party as the party of entitlements, but this is a very bipartisan situation. And I suspect that one of the reasons we have made no headway against the entitlement problem so far is because our citizenry doesn't have the information it should have at its disposal. We mentioned earlier in our conversation the kind of the misimpression which has been inculcated for decades and decades that both Medicare and Social Security are, really kind of like funded social insurance programs, not entitlement programs. That's a very serious misconception. That's a trillion-a-year mistake for the public discourse. But there's all sorts of other things which are readily attainable facts, and I've tried to put together into this little booklet, which I think would help concerned citizens understand where we are. I mean, I did not write Nation of Takers as an obituary for my country. I think there's a lot of scope for dealing with this problem, and I'm actually perhaps foolishly optimistic about the prospect for dealing with this. But the first step in dealing with it has to be to inform our citizens about where we are. Because I think that most people in the United States have got pretty good instincts, and most people in the United States are pretty patriotic. They like to see good things happen for their children, not bad things.
I'll ask you here at the end, so you write about, and you write about one of these. It seems to me tangible signs, and I take your point about obituary, but tangible signs of continuing kind of gloom, one of which is the rise of men who aren't working, which is also, if we go back to 1960, a complete sea change. This is problematic. It seems to be related to this, and this is a lot of people seem to be writing about this after the election, as the rise of Jonathan Last, the rise of the singletons, and this has been going on for a while, but now there seems to be a lot of public conversation about it, of just people not marrying in their 20s and 30s. I mean, it's and also you think 20% of American women don't have any children, another 20% only have one. And this seems to me actually, could lead to, or will probably lead to ready-made clients for the welfare state. I mean, this kind of breaking down, even amongst young people, just not even really entering into marriage, or a reluctance of many to enter into marriage. But yet, what are also we've got to come away with some tangible signs of hope for reform, and I'm interested in what you have to offer there as well.
Sure. Well, I mean, as I mentioned earlier, the crisis of the American family didn't start under Barack Obama. I mean, this is something that's been going on for actually generations. It's a long-term trend, and to the extent that there's family breakdown, there's predictably an impetus to look to the state to be the father financially of the family. I mean, it's not just in America. I mean, this is a big structural pressure in all of the industrial societies. Take that as a given for the moment. Where I think there may be some immediate hope is in dealing with the explosion of disability abuse in the U.S. You mentioned the situation with working men, or with men being increasingly absent from the workforce. It's a long-term trend. We haven't paid much attention to that. We paid a lot of attention to single mothers supported by the state in earlier decades, and we were able to come to a sort of a national consensus about welfare reform back in the 1990s, which has had some consequences, and even possibly some positive consequences. It seems to me that the low-hanging fruit in entitlement reform is dealing with the abuse of our disability payment system. I mean, at this point in time, according to Health and Human Services, there are over 12 million Americans last year were getting one or more payments for the federal government from disability. That's a larger total than the entire paid workforce in our manufacturing sector. Our disability workforce is larger than our manufacturing workforce at this point. And of course, there are people who can't work, but we also know that there's an enormous amount of gaming that system. And able-bodied people gaming especially able-bodied men gaming the disability system, I don't think garners any sympathy from any part of American society. I think this is something that we could put together a very successful bipartisan consensus on dealing with.
How easy is it to game the system? I mean, when you say that, what are people doing?
Well, the biggest claims, or the biggest growth in claims, comes from musculoskeletal disorders, which you and I would call a bad back, and from psychological disorders. It is what you need to do to game the system is to find a doctor who will certify that you have a bad back, or you're feeling sad or feeling bad. There's been one of the things which is very troubling to people who are interested in citizenship in the United States is the extent to which the gaming of the disability system has involved a corrupting of our healthcare officials and a corrupting of our judiciary system, where people get along to go along on this. Leave the trial lawyers entirely out of that. God bless them. But this is a problem which is much more than a financial problem for the U.S. And amazingly, there's been almost no examination of it by the Social Security Administration, by Congress, by the federal government. I think that if we train a spotlight on this problem, we'll have a lot of public support for what, in the former Puritan phraseology, we might refer to as the truly needy and the truly deserving.
Thank you so much for your time, Mr. Eberstadt. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.
This is your host, Richard Reinsch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.